My name is Anthony Tucker-Jones, and I'm a military historian and author based in the UK. I've been freelance for some time. I have about 30 or so books to my name. Main area of interest tends to be latter half of the Second World War, but I have written on an awful broad range of military topics over the years. My background is I used to work for the Ministry of Defence, so I do have a defence background. I've also worked as a defence journalist. I've worked for a number of defence publications over the years. I mean, for a number of years, an awful lot of years, actually, I've been collecting photographs, and that first started when I was at college. I came across this very old second-hand bookshop, and in the corner were an awful lot of Second World War photographs. And I bought a few of those, and one thing led to another. And then a few years back, I was invited by a British publishing company called Pen and Sword to come on board and join a highly successful series that they've been doing called Images of War. And these are essentially photographic compilations, and they cover pretty much most periods from First World War onwards. And obviously, because I had a large photograph collection, I was a good fit for them. And I've done quite a few titles on the Second World War. One of my sort of more specialist interests, and obviously hence your interest because of the Ukrainian angle, is the Eastern Front. I've been fascinated by the Eastern Front for some time, and that's led to a number of books on that topic, both within the Images of War series and some others. I do, in fact, have a major title on the Eastern Front coming up later next year, which is obviously a much bigger work. We're talking sort of 120,000 word long book. The Images of War tends to be a lot smaller, and they're obviously image driven because that's what people like. I enjoy doing them because there tends to be a lot of detective work involved, because a lot of wartime photographs don't come with captions, and when they do, they're quite often incorrect. So there tends to be a sort of bit of forensic work sometimes involved in doing the captioning, which is what I find, makes the challenge more interesting, if you like. I'm just going to wave that because I'm holding it in my hands, and then I'll pop it back over there. Certainly in the UK, the narrative for us tends to be, in terms of publishing and history, tends to be Dunkirk, Battle of Britain, North Africa, D-Day, and then Berlin. Typically our publishing industry and also our education syllabus doesn't dwell a great deal on the Russian or the Soviet Union's contribution towards the Second World War. And when it does, obviously, it tends to focus on the more popular battles such as Stalingrad, Kursk and Leningrad. They're the sort of key ones. But most of the broader aspects of the war on the Eastern Front aren't widely known, certainly in the UK. I mean, I don't know what it's like in Canada. And the net result is because a lot of people don't understand that the Axis included a lot of satellite armies that fought with the Germans on the Eastern Front, and also don't appreciate that the Red Army actually did the lion's share of the work in defeating the Wehrmacht, because obviously the vast majority of the German army fought on the Eastern Front and not on the other theatres such as North Africa, Italy or Northwest Europe. A lot of them I've collected over the years, and then I've had the good fortune of the assistance of a fellow Canadian, in fact, a chap called Scott Pick, who, again, over the years has generated a very large photographic library, and he's assisted with a number of these volumes, very kindly opened up his collection to me. And so that's where the vast majority of them come from. But they come from all sorts of sources. I have friends and colleagues and other researchers that provide stuff. So they tend to come from all over. Most of the stuff that tends to be translated into English deals with the better-known battles, which obviously English readers and English publishers have more of an appetite for. Certainly, obviously, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, archives in Moscow, Kiev, and other major, capitals in Eastern Europe have opened up. Although, funnily enough, I recently had dealings with a lady who was putting together a book who had actually had permissions withdrawn by the Russians for reasons for which she was not entirely clear. So she'd approached me for assistance. I also have a marvellous contact. There's another British military historian, chap called Nick Cornish, and he runs a first-class photograph library called Stavka, which is you'll find it online. And again, he's done a lot of work over the years on the Red Army, particularly the First World War. But as I say, he runs a commercial photo library, which is certainly in the UK is a highly useful research tool. Well, obviously the Germans and their Axis allies invaded in the summer of 41 in June, tail end of June. And obviously the main weight of their offensive was in the north towards Leningrad and in the centre towards Moscow. But they also put some weight to the south, which involved them pushing along the Black Sea coast towards Odesa. So the sort of first stop point for them and the sort of first major defensive line for the Russians was Odesa. And that was the key thing for defending the Crimea itself. I mean, the Crimea was pretty much, apart from its naval facilities, a rather pleasant, Mediterranean climate, backwater, if you like, very popular with senior Soviet dignitaries, a popular posting for the Navy and the military, obviously, because of the climate. But it wasn't a place that was considered to be on the front line. The Black Sea was firmly dominated by the Soviet Black Sea Navy. It was quite sizable, and the only fleet in the region that sort of came anywhere near it belonged to the Romanians. So the Moscow quite rightly considered the Black Sea essentially a Russian lake because of the military might there. So it was never really considered that the Crimea would end up in the firing line. But once Odessa had fallen, the Germans then reached to the north of the Crimea. And the thing with the Crimea is it's essentially an island, if you like, a very large landmass island, with only three ways in and out. One of them is by sea, one of them is by a very narrow land peninsula at the north called the Perekop, or to the east you've got the Kerch Peninsula. So it's very limited on land access, which actually for the defenders turned out to be a bit of a mixed blessing. You'd think that they would create ideal choke points, but of course once the Germans were over them and actually into the Crimea itself, it made it very difficult for them to hold on to the region. Really, the campaign in the Crimea was very much a sideshow. Ultimately, they didn't really need to conquer it. What they could have done was simply cut the garrison off. The Luftwaffe fairly quickly dominated the skies over the Black Sea, which neutralised the effectiveness of the Black Sea fleet. So the Germans didn't really need to invade it. What they could have done was simply kept the garrison held up. But the German senior commanders got it in their mind that they wanted to obviously clear the garrison out, secure their right flank prior to pushing towards northeast towards Stalingrad, and then obviously north-south into the Caucasus, and ultimately with the oil fields in that part of the world. It also meant once they were over the Kerch, it gave them a land bridge into the Caucasus, which was a much quicker route than obviously going along the coast of the Sea of Azov just to the north. So in their wider military thinking, that's why they conducted that campaign. The size of the forces committed to the initial battle weren't that large. I mean, they managed to overcome the Russian garrison with limited resources. But that has to be said that the garrison lasted a long time. Even once they were into the Crimea, the garrison in Sevastopol lasted around 250 days. So it wasn't a pushover. I mean, the Red Army decided it was going to hold that port, and it held it for as long as it could. The major problem it had, of course, was getting reinforcements, supplies and casualties in and out in the face of the Luftwaffe. Initially, the Black Sea Fleet ran the gauntlet of those air attacks and did quite a good job of it, but it eventually got to the state where Stalin himself forbade the Black Sea Fleet from committing any of its large vessels to that part of the Black Sea, obviously because they were losing them at such a rate. The Soviet Union essentially had three fleets. So there was one in the Baltic to the north, one in the Far East of the Pacific operating out of Vladivostok, and then the one in the Black Sea where Sevastopol was the main naval base for the region, and in fact I think remains that so to this very day. But they also had naval facilities on the eastern coast of the Black Sea in what is obviously today independent Georgia, Batumi being one of them, of course. But there were a good, I think, 3 or 4 other naval facilities that they had there on that eastern coast from which they could operate. But Sevastopol, very much, dating right back to the 1800s and the Crimean War, always had been a major fortress and a major naval base. So it was sort of the key facility, if you like, for the Black Sea Fleet to dominate that body of water. Once the Germans arrived, the Luftwaffe was very powerful. And in the opening stages of the invasion of the Soviet Union, they took out the Soviet Air Force very, very quickly, like their tank fleet. Also, most of their aircraft were destroyed. And also, like the army, the Soviet Air Force was in the process of modernization. So Hitler struck the Soviet Union at exactly the optimum point that he could have done, because unfortunately, a lot of the units were transitioning over to new aircraft that they weren't familiar with, they weren't trained on. There was a paucity of spare parts and ammunition. So for the Germans, they'd struck at the optimum time. So what it meant was the Soviet Air Force was not really in a strong position to help defend the skies over the Crimea and indeed the Kuban to the east, which again, of course, enabled the Germans to get into the Caucasus. And it wasn't until about 1943 in the air battles over the Kuban that the Soviet Air Force managed to turn the tide, and obviously would then be able to reassert some control over the Crimea, which again enabled the Soviet fleet to take a more active part. That's not to say that the fleet wasn't involved, because during the course of the campaigns to control the Crimea, the Red Army did at least 2 amphibious operations into the eastern part of Crimea, and on both occasions, the divisions involved were moved by the Soviet fleet. And of course, that's in the days before amphibious warfare, so there were no landing craft, no landing tank ships or anything. They simply put them on cruisers and destroyers and sailed them across the sea, and then they had to put them into smaller boats and get them ashore, which was not an easy task, obviously, when they're being shelled by German coastal batteries and attacked by the Luftwaffe. So they showed enormous courage conducting those operations, both of which, certainly the first one was not successful and the second one only had limited success. The main thing for me, and particularly for an English-speaking reader, is the aspect of the role that Kursk took in the campaign of Crimea, because obviously Kursk is a long way away from Crimea. Once the Red Army had won there and swung the tide slightly into its favour, what it meant was that the was increasingly in risk of being cut off, and is indeed what happened. Hitler, in his infinite wisdom, issued his normal dictate in which the garrison were not to withdraw, even once the Red Army had passed the Perekop Peninsula at the north, thereby cutting them off. Because his view was that they would make an ideal springboard to launch a counterattack with. The fact that he did never have the resources to do that's another matter. But what it meant was the German garrison, and indeed a sizable Romanian one, were cut off once the Red Army had landed again with a view to liberating the Crimea. And initially the Romanian Navy had kept largely out of the way for fear of attack by the Soviet fleet or the Red Air Force. But by 1944 were the only way of getting that trapped garrison out. So they ended up with what I've likened to Dunkirk, is that the Romanian Navy very, very bravely sailed across the Black Sea, by which time the Soviet Air Force had air superiority, so they were under attack by surface vessels, submarines, and Soviet fighter bombers, made their way to Sevastopol and a number of other ports, Yalta, on the southern coast of Crimea, and managed to extract around 120,000 men, which is no mean feat. It's quite remarkable. They did that obviously to retrieve their own people, the Romanian army, but also they rescued an awful lot of German troops, which officially were under orders to remain put. The only tragedy with the whole thing was that the German commander there in the Crimea didn't authorise the evacuation that much quicker, because they could have saved more men. They managed to get about 120,000 out, but lost a similar number once Sevastopol was liberated by the Red Army. So, I mean, both sides had official cameramen and film crews which would document battles, particularly if they were winning, because obviously they had great propaganda. But what happened, particularly with the Germans at the start of the war, although they were supposed to, a lot of them took small cameras along with them and photographed war trophies. So they photographed themselves, on top of tanks, shot down aircraft, and there are an awful lot of images like that were taken by private soldiers. Now, as the war progressed, certainly from the Germans' perspective, by 1943, there was no great desire to do that because obviously by that time they strategically were in retreat. It's sort of from 1941 to 42, you get an awful lot of what I call trophy photos of Germans posing with, POWs, captured equipment. And then likewise with the Red Army, obviously 41 to 43, they were not minded to chronicle their defeats. It wasn't something Stalin or indeed the public wanted to dwell on. But post when the tide started to turn, they made a much bigger effort to document and chronicle the battlefield and their victories. So, for instance, with the book on the Crimea, I included a number of very poor quality photos of captured equipment. But obviously they were taken by Russian photographers keen to document, not unreasonably, their victory and liberation of the Crimea. The problem is certainly with translating things into English, there has to be a commercial imperative to do that, and there has to be a readership ready for it. So it does tend, certainly former Soviet sources do tend to be fairly limited on the ground in terms of English language stuff. And again, certainly in the UK, the Crimea is not a battle of great interest, if you like. The interest tends to come from the English reader's perspective of the involvement of General von Manstein, who of course was a famous panzer commander, the Wehrmacht from a number of rather tricky spots, sort of 42, 43 on the Eastern Front. So he's quite well known and famous as an accomplished panzer commander. But it was his 11th Army that actually conquered the Ukraine and obviously the Crimea, and it was his victory there that got him elevated to Field Marshal. He was so delighted with his performance that it ensured that he got, that he was promoted. And also he was a linchpin in the battles for another major Ukrainian city, obviously Kharkov, is that Manstein managed to defeat the Red Army on a number of occasions in that region. On one memorable occasion, going against Hitler's orders, was told not to withdraw, but knew that tactically it was a sensible move to do that, so the Red Army would overextend itself, and then he was counterattacked. So he won a major victory there. So that's what made him famous. So in terms of it being, one of the campaigns that he was involved in, to English readers, that's what makes the Crimea of interest. And also, of course, for the British, obviously, from our end of things, it's also that connection with the Crimea War, because obviously, the Battle of Balaclava and Inkerman and all those sorts of battles that were fought in the 1850s. There are still large, attended graveyards there from the casualties from the Crimean War. So from that respect, it has some interest. But I think, ironically, the Crimea War tends to be of greater interest than actually the Crimean campaign in the 40s, 1940s. That's one of the great challenges with doing those sorts of books, is the detective work and trying to work out where they are, what they're doing. I mean, obviously some of it's quite basic, so you can tell, by their uniforms, by their equipment, because obviously that changed over time. Quite often the expression of the people involved will give you some indication of what's going on. If they're smiling, then that's clearly going well. For instance, if they're not wearing helmets, they're clearly not near the front line, or there's no fighting going on. If they're clean and well shaven, obviously it's an area where they've got support facilities that's catering for them. So there's all those sorts of things that help build a picture. And certainly in terms of the battle for the Crimea, the challenge for me there was which hopefully I've achieved, was to create a narrative around the photos. Because I say, obviously, this Images of War series is anchored on those photographs. So the challenge is to create a narrative that's interesting and informative to the reader. I think probably as background, it might help people understand why Moscow did what it did in terms of reasserting control of the Crimea from an independent Ukraine, because obviously of the military significance of the region, rightly or wrongly. I'm kind of straying off track here, but if you're asking me in terms of the Second World War, what shaped Moscow's desire to retain the Crimea, it would principally be Sevastopol, obviously, and its role in Russian minds defending the Black Sea. It's not for me to, prejudge what Moscow's motives were, but certainly, if you're asking me, I would say one of the things, I guess, that probably caused Moscow some concern was Ukraine's developing relationship with NATO and the EU, which Ukraine had every right to do. But I suspect if you're a Russian military planner, that would have caused you unease at the idea of NATO potentially having naval basing access in the Black Sea. And I think the historical link back to the Second World War is what would have shaped, Russian thinking on that issue. But obviously the Russians and the Ukrainians spilled blood shoulder to shoulder, defending the place and liberating the place. So both countries have a shared history, if you like, and I would hope that comes through from the book. I almost liken Ukraine and Russia's relationship to that of England and Scotland. That, we have an awful lot of common history. A lot of our successful generals have been Scottish. A lot of our successful regiments have been Scottish. So within the United Kingdom, Scotland and the English have shed blood together. But you can understand Scotland's desire for independence. And in a way, to my mind at least, I see parallels there with the Ukraine and its, sadly these days, very, very troubled relationship with Russia, that they have common history and they've shed blood together. But you can understand why the Ukraine ultimately would want to be independent. Obviously, that process has not gone as smoothly as the Ukraine or the rest of the world would have liked. But, I think that's what's brought us to where we are today. Certainly in the West, we struggle to understand the history and the rationale for how Crimea ended up like it did. I say, obviously, Britain's got a history there because of its connection with the Crimea back in the 1850s. And obviously, at the time during the Second World War, the Red Army were allies of the Western Allies. So again, we were fighting to the same ends. But I think over and above that, there's not a great appreciation of the sort of Russian imperial history, how the Russians conquered the Crimea from the Tatars, the relationship between the Ukraine and the Russians in terms of, who owns it, who controls it, who has the greatest. It's certainly not great, widely understood in the UK. But I say, and I think that's kind of reflected in my perception of how its role in the Second World War is viewed, in that it's not a widely known battle, and certainly the scope and scale of it is not widely known. There are a number of very good books that have been published in the UK in recent years on it, but I say usually interest is driven solely by von Manstein's involvement. And again, as I say, for me, although I knew something about the campaign before I wrote the book, for me the real eye-opener was the scale of the involvement of the Romanians, because again, in the UK, people have little understanding that Hungary, Romania, Italy, Bulgaria all played their roles in the war on the Eastern Front one way or another. Your average person simply doesn't realise that the narrative is that it was purely a German invasion with German troops, which is certainly not the case. I mean, again, the prime example of that, of course, is with Stalingrad. most people understand when it occurred and the outcome of it. What they don't realise was, of course, is the German collapse was solely down to their reliance on the Axis satellite armies that simply did not have the equipment or the ability to withstand reinvigorated Red Army, which is why they folded. I'll say certainly with going back to the Crimea, it simply isn't widely known the role the Romanian army or the Navy played, or the ingenious lengths that the Germans went, in fact, to overcome the garrison. They had these enormous siege mortars which they developed to overcome the French Maginot Line, and they had those shipped down there. They had motor torpedo boats shipped down the Danube. I mean, they actually ended up the Black Sea Flotilla. They managed to get a number of naval vessels and submarines, I believe, into the Black Sea to counteract the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. They put them on barges, took them apart, and sailed them down. They just disassembled these things in parts, rebuilt them as kits. So, again, there was a major land campaign on the ground in the Crimea and over it, but there was also a fair amount of considerable naval warfare on the Black Sea itself. We're not talking fleet to fleet, but there were an awful lot of smaller actions involving motor torpedo boats. That was one way the Soviet fleet went, was obviously once they discovered that their larger surface vessels were being sunk at an alarming rate. They then relied on much smaller attack craft because, again, of course, the Axis were relying on supply convoys coming out of Constanta because a lot of the time it's actually quicker to sail it there than it was to put it on trains and ship it across Eastern Europe and down through the western part of the Soviet Union. That's a good question. It can be quite difficult. It takes practice. So what I was saying earlier, you can date a photograph by the uniforms and equipment, and indeed quite often the firearms they were wearing, or their helmets, because as the war progressed, the equipment changed. So that can give you an audit trail on dating stuff. I'll give you a prime example. The Russian army started off with a helmet that looked very, very, very similar to the German one. And for obvious reasons, they got rid of that fairly quickly. So a large proportion of the Red Army in sort of 1939, 1940 had, I'm going from the top of my head here, I can't remember what model it was, something like model 1936 helmet, but very similar to the German helmet, dubbed the coal scuttle, in that it had, a definable rim around the back of the neck and at the front. So it made them look like German soldiers. So they very quickly changed that, because it led to friendly fire incidents. So it's that sort of detail that helps you date photographs. You can also sometimes, the type of equipment they're using, determine where they are. For example, certain tanks weren't used in certain places. A certain artillery only has a certain role. But I say it does take practice, and it can be quite difficult. I say if there's captions, then obviously that gives you some idea. As I said earlier, sometimes the captions themselves are wrong or misleading. So there's a fair amount of detective work involved. I mean, obviously I have access to collections that held by people I know, as I mentioned earlier. Near where I live, I'm very lucky. There's a military vehicle museum, and indeed they have that happen. They get donated stuff. So not Eastern Front, but a while back I was up there, and they'd been bequeathed the documents and photographs of a member of the 7th Armoured Division, and there were an awful lot of photographs that he'd taken himself, but also allegedly he'd captured a camera from a German soldier from the Afrika Korps. So when he'd had those developed, there were, sort of rear area photographs that this individual had taken. So you even now, in the 21st century, you still get stuff coming to light. People often just don't realise, the interest or value that they might have. I say in the instance of the 7th Armoured Division chap, there were a lot of photographs of Italian equipment, which is not as widely known as the German stuff. Again, from the types of photographs of the German equipment, you can date it because obviously certain things are introduced at certain times. So yes, it does happen. Many years ago, I ended up with a few photographs simply from a junk shop. Went in there and the owner had some photographs of a Luftwaffe officer, obviously come out of an album. You do tend to find that, but over the years albums get broken up because obviously what people do is they take out the more interesting photographs and they'll get given away or sold off separately. The irony is, in recent years, of course, that's led to an awful lot of copies and fakes. There are people who collect photographs as a hobby, so they are wary to knowing, that the paper it's printed on is not correct, or there are various ways of telling. I'm sure there are lots of photographs of atrocities that were taken over the years that have never been made public simply because they're viewed as not, suitable for the public, if you like. I think with some collections there is an air of self-censorship and also sensitivity. I think certainly, like you say, with things of pogroms and massacres and the Holocaust, it's very difficult to make that. There's a fine line, if you like, between making it a historical document and something that's a bit voyeuristic. And I say I'm sure most of the photographs I ever see are then it's a bit like modern warfare. The public does not get to see on the screen. I hope readers find it interesting. I thoroughly enjoyed writing it. It was a good challenge. As I said earlier, I have done a number of these books already. Each one brings something new to the table. Certainly for Western readers, it's a campaign that's not widely known. People do tend to enjoy the photographs, but as you've rightly deduced, there are introductory chapters, so it's not just photographs with captions. Each chapter has an introduction that puts it in context, and also acts as a basic guide to the campaign. So you can read the book and come away with a sense from beginning to end as to exactly what happened. I guess in that respect, it's a good primer on the subject, if you like.